In this video, I'm going to give an overview of the nervous system. We're going to focus on the neuron, and the structure of the neuron, and how they connect with one another. So first of all, think about what your nervous system does for you. As you're listening to this video, it's because of your nervous system. You've got an electrical impulse being sent along your auditory nerve to your brain. And that message is going to be integrated with some other information. For example, the electric signal coming from the optic nerve from your eye as you watch this video. It's all going to your brain, where hopefully you're thinking about what you're watching and listening to. Scientists estimate that if you took 1 cubic centimeter of brain tissue, you'd have in there several million nerve cells. And for nerve cells, there's kind of two types. There's the neurons, which you've probably heard of already, and then there's the cells that help the neurons. And these are called neuroglia. And glia means glue. So you can think of it like these are the cells that hold the other neurons together and help them out. This image, by the way, is a PET scan. You might have heard of a PET scan before. It's used to diagnose cancer. The way it works is that the cells in your brain metabolize sugar, and so based on how fast they're metabolizing the sugar, we can tell which parts of your brain are active. So how do we know which parts are metabolizing sugar faster? Well, we make radioactive sugar and we inject it into the patient, and then the radioactive sugar gives off radiation, which we can detect in our detector as the sugar moves through the brain. So that's what a PET scan is. Then your nervous system also helps you with coordination and movement. Okay, but in a more general sense, your nervous system helps your body maintain homeostasis, which is that common theme that runs right through this course. How does your body maintain that steady state? Well, to maintain homeostasis, your body has to communicate. Like parts of your body have to communicate with other parts. So how does your body communicate? Well, there's two different ways. You've got hormones, which travel through your bloodstream, and you've got nerves, which are clusters of neurons that conduct electrical signals. One comparison between these two is that nerves are more targeted because they travel along a direct pathway to a specific cell, whereas hormones float around in the blood until they find the cell with the correct receptor on the cell membrane before they can do what they're supposed to do. There's 3 overlapping functions of the nervous system. We've got sensory input. So for example, the cells in your skin that can detect temperature or pain, those would be receptor cells. That would be part of the sensory input. And then that's going to send a signal to your central nervous system, where that signal is going to be integrated. And then your body might respond to the heat or the pain or whatever the stimulus is, and that's because of the motor output. That is the signal being sent to the effector cells. Those are the cells that are going to do something about the stimulus. So there's a lot of big words here, but you can just think of it like we've got the input, and then we've got the integration, and then we've got the output. Now a couple of terms from the previous slide. The central nervous system, which is abbreviated as CNS, that's your brain and your spinal cord. And then the rest of your nervous system is the peripheral nervous system, or PNS for short. So if this person here gets the pain in the arm, let's poke him with something sharp. Those receptor cells are going to send an electrical signal from the peripheral nervous system through to the central nervous system, part of the spinal cord, for integration. So we might have a nervous signal that travels up to the brain and says, ouch, that hurts. And then we might have another signal that goes to an effector cell. This would be a motor neuron. A motor neuron traveling to an effector cell, such as a muscle cell, that's going to cause his muscle to contract and move his arm away from the pain. The two types of cells we mentioned before, neurons and the neuroglia. Example of the neuroglia would be Schwann cells. And we'll see in a couple of slides what they do. Here's a diagram of a sensory neuron. So the same example we used before, we've got receptor cells in the skin. And then notice that wrapped around the axon here, we have a myelin sheath. And what that is like a jelly roll like layer of phospholipids, which wraps around and around and around, providing insulation for the neuron. And when I say insulation, I mean insulation for the electrical signal. So that's called the myelin sheath, and it's made by the Schwann cells. So Schwann cells that's an example of the helper cells, or the neuroglia. Notice there's little gaps in the myelin sheath. Those are called nodes of Ranvier. Then we have the cell body. Inside the cell body we have a nucleus. And then we have the axon, which terminates in these little endings called axon bulbs. Okay, and so how is this nervous signal going to be passed on to the next neuron? Here, by way of something called neurotransmitters, which we'll talk about in another video. Now, neural pathways can be fairly complicated, and there's lots of different forms, but the typical neural pathway is we have a receptor, then we have the sensory neuron, which carries the signal to an interneuron. Inter just means between, so you can think of this like a neuron between other neurons. Okay, and this is in the central nervous system. And then from the interneuron, we have the signal conducted along a motor neuron to effector cells. So there's three basic types of neurons: the sensory neurons, the interneurons, and the motor neurons. And they do have slightly different shapes. Notice the ending here called the dendrites. That comes from the word dendron, which I think is Greek. It means tree. You can see why it would be called a dendrite, because it's so branched like a tree. In this case, branched many, many times, the interneuron, and that increases the surface area, and it would allow for many, many connections to other neurons. Okay, there's some other differences between these which you'll need to know. We'll talk about that in class. So here again is just an overview of the neuron. Which way would the electrical signal be conducting? Well, the dendrites, those are the receivers, so they would receive the signal. And the axon terminal, that's the transmitter. So the overall, the path of the electrical signal would be that way. Note the myelin sheath wrapped around the axon, made by the Schwann cells. And then finally, just a couple more points about that myelin sheath. You may have heard the term gray matter or white matter before. That refers to whether or not the neuron is myelinated. Myelinated just means it's surrounded by a myelin sheath. And if so, we would call it white matter. A non-myelinated neuron would be called gray matter. And so in this electromicrograph here, what we're looking at is a cross-section of the axon. This is the axon in the middle. And you can see the many, many thin bands. That's the myelin sheath wrapped many, many times around the axon. Hence the term jelly roll-like layer of lipids. Incidentally, the disease MS, or multiple sclerosis, that's a disease which causes the deterioration of the myelin sheath. And so if you think about it, that means that the axon is losing its insulative layer, which would affect its ability to send an electrical signal, and that can result in loss of coordination and various neuromuscular disorders.